Hi, I'm Steve Pleich, and I'll be your guest this evening for Voices from the Village. Tonight we'll be talking about refugee children, a human rights crisis. Let me start by describing kind of a little background about where we're going. Over the past few years, and in particular over the past few months, the number of children and families leaving Central American countries of El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras, and arriving in neighboring countries and at our southern border has grown significantly. Already in fiscal year 2014, more than 57,000 children have arrived in the United States, double the number who made it to the U.S. southern border in fiscal year 2013. The number of families arriving at the border, consisting mostly of mothers, infants, and toddlers, has increased in similar proportions. This is a really fascinating subject matter, and I'm really delighted to have with me two people who are very knowledgeable and who are really engaged in this process. Welcome, Paul Johnston. Paul, welcome back.
Thank you, Steve.
And Marvin Santano. Marvin,
hi.
Welcome to you.
Thank you.
Paul, you have been with us several times on Voices. You and I have done several different things over the last few years in activism. Just give the viewers again a reminder of kind of who you are and what your background is.
Well, I'm a sociologist and also a community organizer, and I've been trying to learn about public life and participate in it for about 40 years in this area, one way or another. Over in San Jose and down in Salinas, but increasingly here in my own backyard here in Santa Cruz. And I'm part of the Immigration Action Group, which is a network of people who are who work in different ways to support immigrant rights and to expand the participation of immigrants in our community.
Yeah. And thank you also for your great work with the PDC, the People's Democratic Club. We hasten to always get a shout out to them. And Marvin, help me out. Centero? Centero, welcome to you.
Thank you.
Give us a little bit of your background and let the people know, what you've been doing in your life.
Great. Well, I was born in Los Angeles, and at the age of 5, my parents from El Salvador decided to migrate due to financial instability here. I lived in El Salvador in a small province called Santana for 10 years, where I was able to continue my academic journey. Right. And at the age of 15, I decided to migrate because parents, people in the community used to tell me this, this American dream and what the U.S. acquaintance is to reach the goals and a better future. So I came here to high school, graduated. I thank my aunt who provided me shelter and food. Yeah. And thank God that I'm now here at the university where I had to thank my mentors who, through them, I got to love the activism I do today.
And I didn't mention in the introduction, but I will now, that you are working with the Committee in Solidarity with the People of El Salvador, so that's wonderful.
Thank you.
Paul, you and I were at the Board of Supervisors on a Tuesday. Of course, I was there bringing the ACLU proposal to have a moratorium on camping ban to the board, and you were there speaking both eloquently and passionately, as you usually do, about this issue. In fact, it was your testimony there that really kind of inspired me to approach you and say, hey, let's put a show together. Let's talk about this more and let people of Santa Cruz get a broader understanding of what's going on. Lead us off in the conversation and tell us kind of, where we're going with this.
Well, I think you can't, if you pay any attention to the news at all, we've in our community have become increasingly aware, as of people across the country, of the thousands of children especially, and moms and children been coming to especially the South Texas border, turning themselves in and seeking refuge here in the United States. Refugee camps are expanding on the Mexican side of that border even now. And it really came home to us in this area when another small town in California hit the news, Murrieta, California, in Southern California, where there's a federal processing center for families and children, for moms and kids who were being processed through the Department of Homeland Security as refugees. And the mayor of that town and some of the folks, especially from the fundamentalist Christian university that's there, turned out to picket and block the buses. And that created an image across the country I think it led a lot of us in California communities to ask, well, where do we stand? And I'm really happy to say that our community, Santa Cruz, Watsonville, Santa Cruz County, Watsonville, City of Santa Cruz, and points in between, and have had a different take on this situation, have been much more hospitable and supportive, and the action at the Board of Supervisors was part of that.
That's wonderful. And Marvin, now, I was a little distracted at the Board of Supervisors myself. Were you there as well speaking with Paul? Or you did not appear and give testimony at the Board of Supervisors last Tuesday?
No, I wasn't able to.
Well, tell us a little bit about your work with the community, the Committee on Solidarity. That sounds fascinating to me, you know, to really get some traction on the issue through a committee, through that kind of organization.
Definitely. Primarily we have worked close with the Salvadoran Committee of Santa Cruz. As a CISPA's representative, one of the main things that we have gotten together is to have a couple of our members see if we can find resources, collect, gather,
Right.
What we call in Spanish víveres, or goods that that we can provide to these children that are right now in need. And especially since on campus at the university, we tend to host as many discussions with as many resources centers to provide us with financial assistance, and in order for us to continue our activities.
Well, that's terrific, and the university is and should be a wonderful forum and really a center for organizing that kind of thing. Paul, you were kind enough to send on a kind of an outline of how we might approach this issue, and I think maybe it's wise for us to kind of follow that a little bit. One of the first things you mentioned is that the communities are sending aid to refugees on the border. You mentioned that churches, unions, PDC have collected several hundred pounds of new items that are now on the way to the border. Give us a little bit of the background and flavor of that.
Well, the person who took the initiative on this was Watsonville Mayor Karina Cervantes. I think she deserves a lot of credit. She brought people together, especially from the faith communities, in a prayer vigil in the Watsonville Plaza about a month ago now. And that inspired people from a number of faith communities, as well as other groups, unions, and our People's Democratic Club to gather donations. And over the last 3 or 4 weeks, we've collected 500 pounds. And it's been quite inspiring because you see people who are themselves typically don't have very much money, who have gone to the Target or the drugstore or whatever and picked up the things we've asked for, which are women's undergarments and female hygiene products, socks, shampoo, soap, toothbrushes, school supplies. And we've had volunteers working on sorting, and this is all new stuff, and putting them into boxes and weighing them, and then we hauled them, volunteers hauled them on trucks over the hill where they were taken to Guadalupe Church, where a similar drive is going on.
Okay.
And then the Teamsters Union has volunteered a big semi-truck trailer, which is leaving from Oakland down through the Central Valley to pick up similar donations all the way down the valley, mostly in farm worker towns.
And these will also be delivered where now?
They'll be delivered to refugee families on one side or the other of the border in Arizona and Texas.
Okay. And Marvin, now is the campus kind of galvanized around trying to put some supplies together, or some sort of tangible aid to folks who are really in need in this situation?
As of right now, because it's the school term period has ended.
Oh, that's right, sure, yeah.
Definitely, on the other side, student activists have definitely gathered with other organizations and in other local meetings with local organizations in order to find out ways on how to get involved right away.
Yeah, I think that's a wonderful thing to do. Paul, you mentioned again in your outline is that the needs of the refugees that are arriving in our community now. And you're talking about 20 plus unaccompanied minors have been released to their families in our county alone. And the Board of Supervisors, we were discussing before the program, has started a process to help sponsor about 8 to 10 kids whose families have not been located. amongst their needs are economic, legal, psychological, etc. Tell us more about that, because that is really a wonderful program, and that's really where we should be on this issue.
Well, the ball has just started rolling, and to their credit, Supervisor Bruce McPherson and John Leopold started the ball rolling as far as the county is concerned, offering to facilitate foster arrangements for some kids who are pending finding their families, and placing them with local homes rather than in these detention facilities, which are just not good places for kids. And at the same time, probably with support from our state legislature now, although I'm not even sure. You know, I think the immigration attorneys in our community are anxious to provide legal assistance, and I know the ACLU has been very interested in helping to provide legal services to these kids as well. So our community is starting to come together, both for the collection of material aid, as we talked about a moment ago, and to form a network of support for social needs, for maybe housing needs, certainly for legal services, maybe for mental health services, because these kids have often been through a very traumatic experience. We're just starting to get organized to provide a supportive system. It appears that Catholic Charities will hopefully play a central role in this process, but community groups and faith communities will be important as well. And we've decided formally, the Immigration Action Group, to form a refugee aid committee, which had an informal meeting already and will be meeting again very soon. And so we invite people who want to get involved to contact us, and we'll follow up.
Marvin, I wanted to ask you about, unfortunately, we wanted to have Carolina Fuentes here with us today. She was unable to attend, but she is a member of the Salvadoran Committee of Santa Cruz. Are you familiar with that, and what is their work?
Well, we're like a young, I would say, young cross-section group that has been active in the last few years, in the last 2 years, I believe. And I joined last year, particularly because I wanted to learn more about it, and because I didn't want it to stay on campus all the time.
Right.
And I attended one of the events and was earlier talking to Paul about how we, as a collective, host activities in the community. And one of them was when Carolina Fuentes, who happened not to be here today, but she was one of the main events she was able to share her dissertation work in terms of music, Salvadorian music, and and its name, Our Right to Sing. And it's one of the aspects that the Salvadoran community hosts that not only participates like politically within current issues, but also culturally. And another huge influence that we had in terms of the Salvadoran presidential elections last year, or this year, was that we organized almost for a year in terms of raising funds, in terms of raising lots of tension here within the community, because we are currently the second largest Latino community in the whole state, and just within Santa Cruz here, we have almost 5,000 of Salvadorans. And it's immediately that we need, it's immediate that all Salvadorans right now know who we are.
And it's interesting to me that Santa Cruz County is 30% Latino Hispanic, and we've always had a very strong support and feeling for that culture here. And of course, Merrill College is Latino Studies, I think, at UCSC, and there's been a lot of emphasis on that. I know our Assembly member Luis Alejo, who just wrote an op-ed piece in the Sentinel today about El Salvador, if you may have seen, has been very outspoken. He led a delegation to El Salvador recently, as I understand it, and has been very outspoken about the Central American awareness that I don't think really we've had here in Santa Cruz. I think our focus really has been more on, Mexico and immigration, and Paul and I have done some work on immigration, of course, and so that has been a primary focus. But now I think it's important to really understand that Central America is part of that global, social ecological thing that we need to talk about. Paul, your views about the emergence, kind of a more awareness in sensitivity to the socio-political situation in Central America?
Well, of course, we Americans, we citizens of the United States, tend to learn about geography and about what's happening in the world when these kinds of things happen. And now Central America has been brought to our attention. But of course, the United States has played an active role in Central America for many, many years. And hopefully, what's happening now will stimulate us to strengthen our efforts to change the kind of impact that our government has in that area. But I guess that to me the most important thing that's happening right now for my own community, this area, for California, is the emergence of the Salvadoran community itself as part of our community. And you know, this is a very California thing that's happening. This is what California is. It's one wave after another of new people coming, and people who've been here perhaps for 20 or 30 or 40 years who think California started with them may not be aware that they actually were part of an earlier wave that overwhelmed the folks who were there before. And it was hard for me, actually, because I grew up here in California, as did my parents and their parents. And I used to kind of resent all these newcomers who didn't have the same memories that I did of the old California. But now I've realized this is part of what gives our state its vitality, its innovation.
Oh, no question.
And the new cultures, the new flavors, you know, that just enrich us. So I think we in Santa Cruz are very, very lucky. And if there's any silver linings you could point to on this, I think it's the surfacing of the Salvadoran community, hopefully as a more and more visible force participating in our community.
Absolutely. And you know, as I was reading through literature, kind of, you know, educating myself about this issue, and certainly I need to know much, much more. And I really was delighted to hear your very passionate, as I say, articulate testimony at the Board of Supervisors that kind of piqued my interest about, you know, an issue that we really need to be engaged in. But one thing that I did notice is said that before fiscal year 2011, U.S. Customs and Border Protection officers encountered an average of 8,000 unaccompanied children on an annual basis. The majority of these children came from Mexico, with fewer coming from El Salvador, Guatemala, and even from Honduras. This trend shifted in 2011 when 3 times more children from Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador arrived on the U.S. border, with the majority coming from Guatemala. What has caused that kind of sea change, that trend?
You want to speak to that?
Well, maybe I think there should be, we have to look back more into positioning the Obama administration and looking at how this government has tended to promise a better welcoming, a better, more Latino community, a more secure based community, and more like expected changes just in our communities, in terms of accessing, you know, other institutions like welfare, like education. And in spite of the spike, I think you had to return to me, the spike of 2011, I think that mentions more than just, you know, our government's policies that have affected or have increased, you know, this amount of immigrants coming from Central America.
Paul, I want to go back to something you were talking about earlier. Talking about the Board of Supervisors started a process to help sponsor some kids. Now, this is based, as I understand it, on a program that's already running in Santa Clara County?
Well, they're a few weeks ahead of us. So both counties at this point have expressed their interest in supporting a fostering process. And their county is larger than ours, and so we'll probably have several times more kids in support it. But both counties, I think, are quickly learning that the relationship that's actually most important here is between the nonprofit community, where most foster services are provided, and the Department of Health and Human Services that's responsible for these kids. So the county's actually going to be playing, although it's great that we have that political support, they're sort of pulling the trigger on it, you might that's not a good metaphor. They're opening the door
Okay.
and calling upon the community to provide that kind of support. But I think it's Catholic Charity stepping up that's going to be absolutely central. And if I can just maybe clarify a little bit, I think the point that Marvin was making about what is driving the new waves of immigrants, my sense is that the kids coming here are not really aware of what's happening domestically in terms of either Obama policies or anything like that.
Right.
Rather, it's the spike in violence and the spiraling down of the economy in those three countries that has been the primary driver.
And I'm glad you mentioned that, because we do have a clip that I thought would be appropriate that talks about, you know, the kind of the socio-political situation in Central America, and, you know, whether or not the immigrant refugees and children particularly will ever be able to safely return to their homes if they would choose to do so. Let's see if we can see that clip, and then we can have a little discussion about that.
Are we going to hear?
Can you give a sound? So this is the gist of it. I was hoping we'd be able to get the audio.
Yeah. So in the second half of the conference, okay. So what we're seeing here are portrayals of life and circumstances in Central America, in some of the most violent countries in the world.
Right.
And I don't know if you want to speak to that.
Definitely, this goes beyond certain international issue or human rights issue. I think these problems have developed over the years. Just looking at the American flag and looking, understanding, you know, like going back to even earlier when the U.S. funded, you know, more than $6 billion during the El Salvador Civil War in the 80s to 1992. I think, you know, this kind of participation, I mean, this kind of
And I
times.
think as part of literature that I accessed when I wanted to kind of, you know, educate myself, this is Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador, and this is what we're seeing here. Were three of the 5 most dangerous countries in the world in 2013. The UN Office on Drugs and Crime found that Honduras had the world's highest per capita murder rate in 2012 at 94 homicides per 100,000. El Salvador was 4th in the world. Guatemala was 5th. To put these numbers in context, considered the war-ravaged Democratic Republic of Congo, from which nearly 1 million refugees have fled, has a homicide rate of 28 per 100,000. By contrast, in Central America, countries such as Costa Rica is 8.5, Nicaragua 11, Panama 17.2. So you see the level of violence and really the conditions that are driving people away, you know, on a socioeconomic level.
Yeah, I think it's really important that we sort of make a switch, a mental switch in our understanding of the flow of immigration north at this point in time. While there's been a declining in the numbers of people coming, particularly from Mexico, simply for a better life, economic and social immigrants coming to rejoin their families, et cetera.
Right.
Instead, what we're seeing now is a refugee situation, is generation of refugees and human rights issues that have been intensified in Central America, unfortunately, in part due to U.S. policy, both driving it and intensifying it. So the real question in front of us now is, what is the role of the United States going to be in the future, and how can we use our influence to try to create conditions in Central America that are safer so that people can return? Because typically when either a refugee or an immigrant actually comes from Central America or Mexico, their intention isn't to come and stay here. It's often hoping to return maybe with some resources and an education, and to the place that they love, to the place that they feel connected to. So we need to help make it safe.
Yeah, and my sense of this is that whereas immigrants from Mexico may be coming here because they see an American dream, a better life, but my sense of it is that the problems of drugs and gangs, and particularly youth being exposed to drugs and gangs, is so great, is increasing so exponentially in Central America that they are refugees. They're being driven away by a condition that's intolerable there. And would you agree?
I mean, can you repeat the question one more time?
Well, what I'm saying is that Mexican immigrants over time have come to the United States, I think, for a dream of jobs, a better life, and yet in Central America, particularly the child refugees, with their exposure to and danger of being forced into gangs and crime, are truly refugees, truly human rights refugees who are escaping a situation that their safety is at risk every day. And so they are migrating farther south, farther to the north, to try to escape, a life that can only lead, to crime and to the potential of serious harm and even death.
Definitely, I think as huge as this country is and strong, and strongest in the world, I think you should consider these children, escaping right now as not political refugees, but as, in a humanitarian perspective.
Of course.
I think
no question.
there shall be this
Yeah.
this recognition of what are some of the rooted problems in those countries, and instead of the big question of should we support these children, yes or not, I think the bigger question is why and how we can come up with a better solution. Not a better solution, but a better understanding of these conditions.
And maybe for starters, we can stop doing the things that we have been doing for a long time. If you go really deep, it is interventions, repeated interventions in Central America to prevent democratic development of those societies in ways that are responsive to human needs and might develop a society that's able to take care of its own well and to provide safety and education and so on. For starters, to stop aligning ourselves with anti-democratic forces in Central America. But then more recently, it's of course these gangs that we hear about started here in the United States. It started on the streets of LA and here in California, and it was our deportation policies that exported the gangs down there, not to mention our appetite for drugs that created a market for their activities. And so simply to turn around and deport more kids is simply not the solution.
Right.
And that's to stop doing things that we have done in the past. And then the question becomes, what do we need to start doing? What does our country need to do to start taking responsibility for our sister countries, for societies that are connected to ours in ways that go beyond abstract principles, that have to do with families, that relationships that cross borders, that have to do with history, and have to do with the history of exploitation, economic exploitation through corporations, as well as family connections that just are they're as strong as blood, right? Yeah. So we're really, from my point of view, we're one society in the Americas, and we should start acting that way.
Yeah. Now, Marvin, in the introduction, you were saying that you were born here in the United States, but then went back to El Salvador and spent some time there. Were you exposed to this culture of drugs and gang violence? I mean, were you aware of that? Not necessarily threatened by it, or you may have been. I'm not speaking for you, but were you aware that this was happening down there?
I actually absolutely did not have any idea that this was more of a structural problem within El Salvador, and that it as Paul mentioned, that it comes from more like external problems that create internal issues within these providences. I was raised in by my parents who would always my parents, since they live the ongoing social conflict, which is the Civil War, they they share their stories to me all the time, as how, for example, the military will like threat them with curfews, with their rifles in the streets. If, for instance, this, if this.
Oh, excuse me. I just want to remind people that while we're having this
Okay.
interesting conversation, this is a call-in show, so you can call at 425-8844, extension 30, and ask Marvin or Paul a question. And I didn't mean to interrupt you, but
Yeah, go ahead.
it occurs to me that people who understand anything about the geopolitical nature of the Americas are always concerned about, drug interdiction in South America. So, oh, this is all where the drugs are coming from, the cartels and things like that. They're not necessarily interested, not anymore, in destabilizing the governments down there, because we found that was really a non-starter for us, and weren't getting anything done. And it didn't really interdict any of the drug trafficking anyway. But now, I think with Manuel Noriega, who was a drug kingpin in Panama, people say, oh, Panama, now where's that? That's the Panama Canal. Okay, I understand. Okay, there's Bolivia and there's Chile, and Panama, El Salvador, Nicaragua. People are beginning to get, their geographical, bearings in America, and trying to figure out, where these drugs are coming from, what problems they're causing within each country, and what they're doing to the people who live there. And that's what we're talking about now.
I think there's also roots that that run even deeper, that are economic, that have to do with, for example, the passage of free trade agreements and their impact on the economy and development there too. The overall policy of privatization and of clearing the barriers to U.S. corporations penetrating local markets have been devastating for the local economy. And Marvin, for example, I know your family worked in agriculture, and I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the impact of free trade agreements on
Please, yeah.
people working in that sector.
Definitely. I think from, again, looking back into my background and family, I had the opportunity to work in the cornfields and coffee production in the mountains of El Salvador. What I noted was that as people were screaming no against the Tratado de Libre Comercio, the TLC, which is free trade agreement.
Okay.
So, and I kept wondering what that was, until now that I understand that people over there were obsessed, where they didn't like this policy because it would take away their production, their net income. What they would produce would not, they wouldn't have even, after they would sell their production, couldn't even afford their own meals. So it's like they were producing, all their production wasn't even for them, and that's how badly this free trade agreements have affected not only Central America but Mexico too, and in particularly just because it allows U.S. commercializing and multinational corporations to implement their factories and obtain cheap labor.
Right.
In response to that, they're taking away local small businesses like my grandparents.
Ah, okay.
And I'm looking and I'm thinking, why? That's not fair. And then in contrast to that, there's more like, if you don't do this, if you don't agree to this, to these free trade agreements, these countries, for example, El Salvador, then, for instance, the Millennium, we were talking earlier about the Millennium Challenge Corporation, this under the 20 after the peace accords in 1992, and all up into 2008, we see how more right-wing political governments implemented these policies of free trade agreements. But then again, now with more left-wing political governments, we see a denial on this free trade agreements in time. But it comes to the point where the U.S., since the U.S. offers through this Millennium Challenge Corporation, this fund, it's an amount that the government should have to take in order to implement other policies.
And I think the American small farmer can certainly sympathize with the Central American small farmer because they are being forced out in equal measure by the large agribusiness here. Paul, tell us, Marvin mentioned, and I really did want to talk about it, this Millennium Funding. I think it's a fascinating program to really get some economic traction.
Well,
tell us more about that.
It started under the Bush administration, and development aid, it has some problems because we were talking about earlier, because it promotes a model of privatization of public services. But it does provide some funds that can be used for infrastructure and for redevelopment, reconstruction. And in a country where El Salvador, unlike Guatemala and Honduras, is trying to move in that direction. For example, trying to expand education so that kids can go to school all day long and have a safer place to be during the day. That the release of these funds has been conditioned by the U.S. State Department and specifically by the U.S. Ambassador to El Salvador now on criteria like, for example, until quite recently, that the government would agree to open up the seed market to Monsanto Corporation, which would basically allow Monsanto to establish a monopoly with its patented seeds and take away people's capacity to do what people have done for millennia, which is to save and harvest and improve their own.
No pun intended, of course.
Seeds, right? Yes, right. And so, no, it wasn't intended. How about that?
Oh, we're cleverer than we think. But I bring that up because you did mention that to the Board of Supervisors.
So,
the release of this Millennium Funding.
Yeah, there's been but I think that's only, in a sense, well, yes, and our Board of Supervisors, as well as other leaders like Santa Clara County Board of Supervisors and folks in the Democratic Party are sending as strong a message as we can to the State Department and the Obama administration. But I think, from my point of view, this issue of the Millennium Funds really points us in a direction. And looking at El Salvador versus Honduras and Guatemala as well, just points us in a direction that we have to begin to move, which is to start thinking through a new relationship to Central America, to start thinking through the follies of a policy that emphasizes militarization and repression over social development, and that fails to come to terms with the billions of dollars that we've spent in the wrong direction. We should be able to invest more than a few $1 million, quite frankly, in social development. And we should certainly stop aligning ourselves with anti-democratic political forces.
Now, that brings up an interesting question. In my mind, we're talking about factors on an economic level. What's the political situation in El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras? There's democracy, there's budding democracy, there are right-wing dictatorships. So what is the political situation there? Paul?
I'm not an expert on Central America, so I think it would be a good thing to have a show about, but I would rather not try to characterize, except to the effect that in Honduras and Guatemala, we still have military or pseudo-democratic governments that have been placed in power with strong support from the United States and supported by them, whereas in El Salvador, after years of social conflict, the peace accords ultimately led to an election and another election, and most recently, people who were previously revolutionaries, in effect, are now in the government and attempting to move the government in a positive direction and to achieve reconciliation. And that is why it's so important for the U.S. to rethink its relationship in El Salvador and try to work with the new leadership in El Salvador to help move that society in a positive direction and to use as an example to promote positive change in the other countries as well.
Marvin, you comment on that?
Yeah, I think ultimately El Salvador, as you were mentioning, it carries a well-developed social democratic system now. You can see with under the Funes, Francisco Funes administration previous term that just passed, only with 4 years, you can see how popular programs such as like El Vaso de Leche, the cup of milk, which is implemented in like public high schools from really low, below low income communities. And I feel like just that one. And the other one is providing, another popular program is providing the communities and small cooperativas, small co-ops, the opportunity to grow their products, like products such by offering them sacks of seeds. And it's really and also another change that just happened in just 4 years, as you can see. Before that, which wasn't much changes, you can see how, for example, like the streets and the infrastructure, how these ministers of infrastructure have now finished the jobs that in streets that these previous governments didn't do, And I think it's really amazing now how we can see these changes.
I think that's one of the things maybe that Paul was talking about. I'm certainly in favor of is that when we are getting to the point where we can really help other countries, it should be on the basis of economic incentives or infrastructure or schools or kinds of Head Starts kinds of programs that we have, to make sure that children are well-fed and well-educated, because when you have a well-fed, well-educated populace, you're going to have, that decade, that generation is going to grow up, I think, to really want to have change and positive change and more universal, human rights change when it gets older. Yeah. But Paul, you were talking about things the Obama administration should have on their plate, in terms of addressing the current problems that we have right now, with the refugees that are on our borders, things like that. You have any ideas yourself about, what specific initiatives they should be pursuing now to improve the conditions of the people who are fleeing from Central America and are, now arriving in great numbers on our borders?
Well, I think we need to follow the leadership of the people of El Salvador, that the folks that they've elected, and work with them to try to create safer spaces, safer conditions for kids to return to. And I think that's number one. I think we need to recognize that the Obama administration has inherited a legacy of policy and personnel in Central America that it's perverse, because we're 6 years into Barack Obama's presidency, but it hasn't been rethought. And we have some of the same kinds of emphases, both in terms of policies that emphasize corporate access to markets over human development, that you would think that we're going to change. Many of us thought we're going to change when Barack Obama was elected to office. They still need to change.
Yeah, and it's amongst the disappointments to me about Obama's policies, particularly his foreign policies. I don't think have lived up to the dream that I had when I voted for him the first time, and certainly again the second. But there's much more that we can do. Let's talk for a few minutes about some of the families that are here, some of the families that are being the placement of families, with families who are apparently of Salvadoran descent who are here. That is taking place now. There's a system and the program in place that's doing some good work with that?
There's no program in place yet. We're just at the beginning of that process. What has started to happen is that families who live here, whose children have been picked up at the border and taken into custody, have been making arrangements to have their kids released to them. So we know that as of a couple of weeks ago, that there were about 20 families here in Santa Cruz County alone who'd had their kids released from federal facilities to them, and they're sort of below the radar. Typically, they're I think that Marvin might know a bit more about those families and their circumstances than me. I know it's more than 20 because I was contacted personally by a family just a week before last for help filling out the paperwork to get their 9-year-old son to release to him. So released to them. So as I was saying before, these families have needs. We don't want these kids, many of whom are adolescents themselves, to wind up being pulled into drug life and gang life here in our community. Right. These are kids who are going to be in some ways at risk, particularly because of the traumas they've already experienced, and their families need support. So, but we hesitate as a as a network, the Immigration Action Group does, to sort of put out the word saying, give us a call and we'll help you out, until we've been able to pull together the resources in the community, legal resources, mental health services, social services,
Legal
to be able to
services,
respond, to be able to respond to people. And that's the process that the Board of Supervisors, I think, started to set in motion with their action last week. And then aside from that, there's also this sort of formal foster family sponsorship.
And you mentioned that as well,
which would come, which would bring kids whose families have not yet been identified. And as of now, there is some federal funding for that, which will probably make it easier for Catholic Charities to get involved, but that funding stops the minute that their families are identified. So it's going to be a challenge for us long term, I think, and I think this is just the beginning of us thinking about so things that have already been going on under our noses, you might say, in our own community, and responding to that is the entrance into our community of, I don't want to say strangers because they're not. Typically they have family or networks, you know, here, but of new members of our community who are in need. And it's an opportunity for us as a community to open our arms, open our doors, and you know, live out the values that we share.
Well, and I can hardly agree. Marvin, do you have a personal story of one of the families that you can share with us that you might know about?
There was one case, one of the members of the Salvadoran community, a friend of mine, was sharing that as a group, they gathered at this small delegation and went to Mendota City. And there were a few children who, youth who have actually just got their process, their legal process documented, and now they're able to reunite with their families. But also because they went there because they had to host in one of their family's members who happens to reside there. They had to host them, this young youth people, you know, young people, I would say, to, for example, with, you know, a small dinner, a small play, a small dish, and they shared to us that it was an impact, and it was impacting for them, how their stories, as they were sharing it to me, it was 1 meal a day, being detained at the border, you know, under the Homeland Security, La Migra, and they were kept at which they call cooler freezers, which are these small cells, which have like air conditioner that put pressure under you, and it was just this treatment on how the state keeps people, and right now it's just insane, I think. Go ahead.
And that's why when I was thinking and casting about for, you know, something to call this show, I really wanted to emphasize the human rights, you know, the human rights aspect of it, because it is so chilling, I think. Paul, let me ask you, is the Immigration Action Group, or Marvin, you can respond to this as well, the Salvadoran Committee of Santa Cruz, or CISPAS, are you generating a database, a list of host families that perhaps, you know, you can marry some of our guests to when they arrive?
Yes, we are, and not just families, but we're also looking for, well, we have already begun to accumulate immigration attorney volunteers.
Doug Keegan working with the group?
Doug is part of the immigration, that is the
guy.
Santa Cruz County Immigration Project.
Absolutely, yeah.
Right, but there's also a great network of immigration attorneys in this area. People don't go into immigration law to make a lot of money. They go into it because they believe in human rights and civil rights. And so we have volunteers to tap there. We need people with mental health clinical skills. We need people with social work skills. And you know, up till recently, the Immigration Action Group has been a network that's primarily been focused on the treatment and the mistreatment and the rights of mostly Mexican immigrants, things like the deportation program in our jails.
Absolutely, and you and I have done some work with that over time.
That's right, and the undocumented kids who are brought here as children and then face the threat of deportation and can't work when they get out of high school, and that are being helped now through the DACA program. And I think one of the things that this recent series of developments on the border crisis has done is it has helped us to begin to make connections with the Salvadoran community here. And
Most importantly,
so in the
absolutely,
process, we're building, we're strengthening our network and our relationships, and I think forming the Refugee Aid Committee, and beginning to broaden our perspective on the work that we do, so that it includes policy that's driving the refugee crisis, so that that includes hospitality toward people who come here, and I would say that includes not only folks from Central America, quite frankly, but also people who make that dangerous crossing in the desert in Arizona, and if they survive it, you know, there's not too many more scary things than to wait to see if your mom or your son or your daughter is going to make it across the desert. And so there's a lot more that we can do. In fact, just recently, as we've been gathering contributions and sending them down to the border area, we've been learning that that the folks who are in need on the border are not just the individuals who are turning themselves in, as who are kind of hitting the news, but on both sides of the border, especially on the Mexican side, what's emerging is colonias, they're called, refugee camps, in effect, with thousands of people who are living in terrible conditions and deeply in need. And there are wonderful American community organizations and faith-based groups that are doing what they can to help them, but they are overwhelmed themselves in terms of human needs.
And I think what's most troubling to me is that similar to what's happened to many immigrants and undocumented folks that come into California, they disappear into the system. They disappear into institutions, penal institutions that are secreted away in places and counties that people, you know, can't even contact their relatives. You know, they're not given any access to communication, outside communication, no access to legal help, no access to emotional counseling of any kind. And that's the thing that I find, you know, as I say, most troubling about the situation. I don't want people who are, for whatever reason, coming to our borders, you know, looking for our help, you know, either fleeing the dangerous conditions in El Salvador because of the drugs of the gangs, or fleeing economic dire circumstances in Mexico. I don't want them coming to our borders and then disappearing, you know, under that border, where there aren't any people reaching out to them and helping, as the Immigration Action Group is trying to do, as CISPAS is trying to do, as the Salvadoran community of Santa Cruz is trying to do. And so a group that is willing to reach out to those folks to make sure that they know that we care about them, that we want to help them, we want to do what we can, we are doing what we can for them. That, I think, is the initiative that I would like to pursue, and the initiative that I would like to see folks like yourself and Paul pursue, and I'm certain that's what's happening.
Yeah, I guess I don't see it just as a question of charity, although charity, of course, is a great virtue. But I think we here on the Central Coast ought to recognize that the wealth of our region depends more than anything else on agriculture and on an industry that's been addicted to cheap Mexican and Central and South and Southern Mexico and Central American, increasingly, labor without rights for 50 years now. And we owe it to the folks who produce our food and generate the revenue that comes into a region and then circulates locally is the main source of our economic vitality in this area. We owe it to them to move beyond this era of real apartheid and extend human rights to all of our neighbors.
And Marvin, school is going to be back in session when? You'll be up at UCSC?
Definitely.
Yeah. And when school is back in session, then you'll be working even more with community in solidarity with the people of El Salvador, that group, and doing that. That's wonderful work. We have another minute or two. Let's make sure that we get all the contact information that we need for people who really want to be engaged in this issue. And as Paul, you say, we are a generous community. We're a kind community. That is our culture, and that's what we should be true to. Give us a little bit of contact information as we go out.
Well, the Immigration Action Group is a network. We have very limited resources, so we're trying to develop ourselves more as an organization with capacity. But you could certainly get a hold of us, and it's pretty easy to do so. If you can just remember Immigration Action Group, put it together, and add Gmail at the end of it.
And you had a Facebook page very quickly?
Well, if people want to learn more about what's happening specifically with respect to the border refugee crisis, I think the best Facebook page to go to is the one that's been put together in Laredo, and it's called, just look on Facebook for Laredo HR, wait for it.
And while he's looking,
Yes.
Your contact information again for people?
It's my email can be, you can find me at meceNten@ucsc.edu, and definitely.
Paul, very quickly?
That was Laredo HRT.
Okay.
Just go on Facebook and you'll learn a lot.
Okay. Paul, thank you again for being
Sure,
here. Always
yeah,
a pleasure. Marvin, a great pleasure to meet you. Thank you for your work.
Thank you.
And I've been Steve Pleich, and thank you for watching this edition of Voices from the Village. And tune us in again for Charlie Phillips, our producer, and everybody behind the camera and everybody in the engineering booth. Thank you so much for joining us, and we'll see you next time.